We're very lucky tonight. We have a top British diplomat with a worldview. As it happens, nearly 50 years ago, and we were talking about this over a meal half an hour ago, I was leaving pre-revolution Iran after a long consultancy project, just as Sir Peter was arriving at our embassy in Tehran. So I'm sure he's got lots of stories about that, but that's way in the distant past, because since then he's had major appointments. And as you have read in his bio, he's been one of our diplomats and senior players across Europe. In the Middle East, of course, he would know about that because of his time in Turkey. And most importantly, of course, in the United States, which is the basis of tonight's discussion. He wrote his memoirs quite recently, and it's entitled, They Call It Diplomacy. I looked it up, and it's described as an engaging account. So I think there's a sense of humor in there at work tonight, and we may discover that in the course of the evening. But more than that, what I notice is it insists on the relevance of the diplomat today, despite social media, despite 24/7 communications and so on. So if some of you want to explore that aspect of Sir Peter's career during the question and answer session, then feel free. As we mentioned in the note that was sent out to you a few days ago about the meeting, one of our visitors here was the American Kori Shaka. About 5 years ago, she was the director of the IASS think tank, and she brought her views about this UK relationship. And she'd actually written a book about the history of it. I don't know whether you've read that one, Peter? No? Well, I'd say this one goes all the way back to when the British set fire to the White House. I think it was in 1812 or around about then. So she as an American had a view of the relationship, but one, of course, that was grounded in her current profession. So that was 5 years ago. A lot's changed. The US still dominates the world, perhaps, and I think after 5 years, we need an update at what's a really dangerous time. So I think who better than Sir Peter Westmacott, with his first-hand experience and his British perspective, to discuss this relationship with us. As we explained, we're just recording, or we'll only put the video of the talk on our website, and the Q&A will be according to what's called Chatham House rules, which is interesting because Sir Peter is a senior advisor there. So it does mean that it's private to us, and you can ask all the questions you like. He may be candid, and he can decide which of them he feels able to answer. And I can imagine what some of those questions will be. So, without more ado, please welcome Sir Peter Westmacott.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's extremely kind of you. There's obviously no pressure on me at all. This is the first event of the new season. There's a number of new members of Keele World Affairs. If I'm a flop, then you won't come back, so that's going to be another problem. And the other thing that Bill told me earlier was we do find that the best part of the evening is the Q&A rather than the lecture that comes before it. So there's another expectation for me to live down to, and I'll do my best. So you've probably had a few old buffers like me who used to be in government service, and I'm not the first one, I'm sure, to have been asked, well, ambassadors, diplomats, what are they? Why do we need them? And there's lots of rather familiar old jokes about what's an ambassador for. Well, he's somebody, an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country. We've all heard that before. And then there's a slightly funnier one, which is the job of a diplomat is to tell his opposite number to go to hell in such a way that he enjoys the journey. I always think that's quite fun, and I don't always succeed, unfortunately, in getting it there. But what we do try and do is establish an understanding of different cultures, different parts of the world. I'm a great believer in learning the language and the culture of a country where I'm posted in where I'm representing my country, because I think if you don't have that understanding, then you're not going to be quite as effective as engaging with the people who live there. And there's a rather fun story about different cultures that we all have to come to terms with. And the story goes roughly as follows: that there's a Brit, a German, and a Frenchman all on death row and sitting rotting in a jail in a rather unpleasant country. And the jailer comes to them and says, guys, the bad news is you're all being executed tomorrow. The good news is I've been told to ask you all for a last wish. What would you like? And so the Frenchman says, I would like a nice Chateaubriand with a bottle of a 61 Margaux, please, and before that, une tranche de foie gras, and so I can have a wonderful dinner before my life comes to an untimely end. And the German says, well, I would like to have an opportunity to explain my conception of how international relations should be organized in the future so that people can benefit from my wisdom when I'm no longer here. And then he turns to the Brit and says, and what would you like? And he said, shoot me before the German starts talking. So we're all a little different. And part of the game of trying to operate as a diplomat is to understand that and to take advantage of it, or at least take account of it. And even in America, where we are, of course, two countries divided by a common language, there are moments when the English and the Americans, the British and the Americans, don't always see things in quite the same way. I had a dear friend who was a very senior senator from the Midwest who said to me, well, Mr. Ambassador, over where I live, things are a little bit different to what you seem to think. Like for us, gun control, that's how steady you hold the rifle before you pull the trigger. And climate change, well, that's when you turn up the air conditioning, isn't it? So same language, but sort of different perception of how you deal with the issues. And so that's my kind of lead into trying to talk about whether the relationship between United Kingdom and United States is still special. And you won't be surprised to hear that I think I will conclude that on the whole it is. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about the history of it, because everybody talks about it endlessly. It sometimes annoys the Americans that the Brits go on so tediously about how special the relationship is. And the French love reminding us that they are America's oldest ally, because they, of course, supported the Americans in their war against the tyrant, King George III. And so we all play these games as to who is the special relation, who is the closest friend, and so on. But in fact, if you go back to the time of American independence, what we call the American War of Independence, they call the Revolutionary War of 1770s, most of the Americans didn't actually want to break with the United Kingdom, and I might say that, mightn't I? But it was partly Lord North and partly King George III, and partly the fact that we were making certain demands of the colonies which they just felt they could not live with. And so there were a number of people amongst the initial revolutionaries who really deeply regretted that America and Britain were going to go their separate ways. But they did, and a little bit later in the War of 1812, which you alluded to, when the White House was burnt down by the Redcoats. So, by the way, was a lot of the Capitol Hill, the building where the Congress is established. When President Madison signed the declaration of war against Britain, there were tears in his eyes because he did not think that America and Britain should be going to war. That is, by the way, the War of 1812, which finished in January 1815. That is the last time when Britain and America were not on the same side in a military conflict. We've had a few squabbles since then, but that was the last time we fought against each other. And of course, people like me say it really was terribly unfortunate. It was all Napoleon's fault anyway, because if Napoleon hadn't been trying to blockade Britain while he was trying to conquer the whole of Europe, then we wouldn't have needed to impress some of the American sailors and put them onto our boats and apply the embargo, and then they wouldn't have declared war against us, and. Anyway, there we are. That was another sad event, which a lot of Americans wished had not happened. And after all that was over, America sort of went into its shell. We had the thing called the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which was when the American, which we've all heard about, but nobody quite knows what it means, essentially means that America decided that it would not get involved in anybody else's conflicts, but that the rest of us, that meant the Europeans in those days, were to keep out of the Western Hemisphere and not muck about in America's backyard. And that was pretty much the essence of American foreign policy, right up until more or less, I would say, the First World War. And just as a reminder of how different things were there, Bill was saying America is the most important country in the world. We only had an ambassador in Washington in 1893, because until that stage we had something called a legation, which is a sort of downgraded embassy, run by a minister who wasn't as important as an ambassador, because America was not deemed to be that important on the world stage, and we didn't think we needed to have an embassy. Things have changed a bit since then, but it did take a while. And we sometimes forget that it was not regarded as safe enough for the British monarch to pay an official visit to the United States of America until King George VI went there in 1939. The years before that, even the 1920s, British ambassadors were advising that they thought it was too dangerous and too difficult, and because the memories of the Revolutionary War and the colonial era were still too fresh in people's minds. So it took a while for us to get to a better position. And then I think a lot of this had begun to change during the First World War, which was earlier, of course, than when the King came. But we will all remember that both the First World War and the Second World War, America was still instinctively following that Monroe Doctrine of not wanting to get involved in other people's squabbles. And it was 2 years after the sinking of the Lusitania, with a loss of a lot of American lives, in 1915, that America actually joined the war in 1917, without which, to be honest, I'm not at all sure that our alliance would have been able to see off the Kaiser. And ditto, in a sense, in the Second World War, when America for a long time didn't want to get involved, didn't really want to be fighting a war which was helping the Brits preserve their colonies and their empire, even though Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill's great friend and ally, was sympathetic. The politics of it were very difficult. And there was a thing called the American Neutrality Act in 1937, which made it legally impossible for America to do anything to help us in the early stages of the war. Winston Churchill was busy trying to persuade the Americans to give us as much help as he could, and that did, in the end, succeed very considerably, because we had Lend-Lease and we had destroyers for bases, and we had a number of things that ended up helping us out during the very difficult dark days of 1940, 1941. But remember that America also had an ambassador in London, Mr. Kennedy, the father of President John Kennedy, who was busy saying, the Brits are finished, Germans are going to win, English democracy is over, we should back the winners. And he was actually removed from office not long after making those observations. But that was what we were up against. He was, of course, a rather sort of grumpy Irish-American Catholic who had a lot of baggage from the way in which we had treated Irish Americans, or indeed a lot of Irish Catholics during the 19th century in Ireland, which conditioned then, and still conditions now, a lot of politics in America. So we were kind of up against it. And Churchill had to work very hard, and as those of us who've read up about the Second World War will recall, there was a sigh of almost a visible relief when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, which essentially meant that America had no choice but to come into the war, declared war on Japan, and then Germany immediately afterwards declared war on America. So from then on, we kind of reckoned there was a good chance that this was going to come out all right in the end. It wasn't easy. It was still a very transactional relationship. The destroyers for bases arrangement that we had from September 1940 was not exactly an act of generosity, but it was probably the best that they could do. The Lend-Lease arrangement, whereby they kept us afloat economically in exchange for long-term debt, was converted into a loan of $3.75 billion at the end of the war, which left the British taxpayer, as I'm sure we all remember, paying slightly over $100 million a year right up until 2006. Nobody else was paying war debt, but we did. You might say, well, hang on, we were the good guys. We were standing up against Hitler. Why did we spend money rebuilding Germany and still have to pay our friends and allies war debt at 2.5% interest for the next 50 years. But we did. And that was the way in which the cookie crumbled, so to speak. Now, during all that, and while Churchill was busy recruiting FDR to support us during those difficult times of the Second World War, is when he began to really push this idea of the special relationship. And Churchill wanted it to be seen as such. He wanted to get American public opinion on our side and to feel less neutral, less reluctant to get involved in fighting the good fight for us. I think it first was put on the record at the famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, at the end of the war, when he persuaded President Truman to go with him for a defining, almost a curtain call, really, at the end of Churchill's premiership, which was a speech that went down in history mainly because of the warning he gave about the Iron Curtain descending on Europe as a result of the Soviet occupation of so many of the countries which it had helped liberate. But it was also the moment when I think special relationship became, if you like, part of the daily language of the relationship between our two countries. And so that was, in some ways, a high spot, but it remained quite complicated and, as I say, quite transactional. 5 years later, 1951, there was Harold Macmillan, future Prime Minister, not yet Prime Minister, visiting Washington and writing in his diary when he got home that he found that Britain was considered in Washington, D.C., quote, with a mixture of pity and contempt, unquote, for how we were doing in the 1950s. And then, of course, it became a bit complicated because this whole question of Europe appeared on our political agenda. And in the 1950s, Britain decided that it was not going to go along with the Schuman Plan for the forerunner of European cooperation, the European Coal and Steel Community, the brainchild of Jean Monnet, the Frenchman. And we decided, and Churchill said very firmly, we want to be with Europe, but not in Europe. And there we are, early 1950s. So the seeds of, if you like, much of the political expression of what's happened in the United Kingdom in later years was already there. Now, I think I would argue, and at the time, British government official documents did argue, that making a choice between whether we go along with the Europeans or whether we go with the Americans was something of a false choice. As it happened, Washington did want the United Kingdom to get involved in this new coalition-building exercise in Europe because they thought it was the best way of ensuring that Germany was never going to do what it had already done, and that Europe was going to be strong enough to stand up for itself and not totally dependent on American largesse and security guarantees. But we decided that we were not going to go along with it, even though the Americans advised us that they thought it would be good for them and good for us if we did so. In 1960, there was a then top-secret policy study commissioned by Harold Macmillan, by then Prime Minister, which concluded that if Europe went ahead without us, that would be bad for Britain and bad for American interests as well. The document was written, ministers looked at it, they ticked it off, but nobody actually acted on it. And of course, Churchill, when he left office, 1955, it is said that his last remarks to his ministers in cabinet were, never be separated from the Americans. And that was essentially British policy. But it was complicated. A year later, we had the Suez Crisis, where all hell broke loose when, I don't need to go through into all details of what happened, but essentially the French and the Brits and the Israelis came together to try and teach Nasser a lesson and avoid the nationalization of the Suez Canal through a military operation. Didn't tell the Americans what was going on. The Americans were appalled. They pulled the plug on us. We had to give up in a degree of humiliation. And as a result of the Suez experience, France decided we can never again rely on America for our security and for our foreign policy priorities. We will do our own thing. And you ended up then with General de Gaulle and a degree of Gaullism, if you like, in France, which was not nearly as trusting of or reliant upon the United States as Britain was. We, however, drew the opposite conclusion, which was, oh my God, we've made a mess, we've annoyed the Americans, we better not ever find ourselves in a position on a foreign policy initiative where we haven't got the Americans on board. And that was a sort of beginning, if you like, of Britain and France going off in different directions, at least as far as as the Anglosphere is concerned and as much of foreign policy was concerned. And then by 1962, a little bit later than that, we had the famous Dean Acheson, the then Secretary of State, giving a speech which is sort of drummed into the memories of people like me trying to understand foreign policy, saying that Britain had lost an empire but had yet to find a role. And we were very upset by that. We thought this was disrespectful of a great nation which had come out on the winning side of the war, and that America should not be talking to us like that. And in the same speech, the same sentence even, he went on to say that he thought that Britain's idea of detaching itself from Europe and instead relying entirely on an American lead made no sense and was not in America's interest nor in British interest. And for good measure, he banned the use of the phrase special relationship in State Department for as long as he was the Secretary of State. He actually was an Anglophile, but that was his perception of where Britain and America had got to in the early 1960s. So that was the direction we went along in. It was very important to the decisions that we subsequently took over the creation of our nuclear deterrent, submarines, missiles, warheads. The French did their own thing. We went with the Americans. It was not a terribly good financial deal, but it was actually the only one that we had. Initially it was Polaris, then it became Trident. We still make our own warheads, but we still rely on the Americans for the missiles which would deliver them from our nuclear submarines, which are patrolling as we speak, or one is anyway, somewhere under the ocean. So we went with the Americans out, and the French went their own way. And that was a part of the of the strategy that we adopted. That deterrent, for what it's worth, is, although we talk about our independent nuclear deterrent, precisely because we are that much dependent on the Americans, and our submarines go to a place called Kings Bay on the Atlantic coast for refurbishment of the missiles and servicing and so on, we're not quite as independent as we would like to think that we are, even though we do make our own warheads and though it is British hands on the triggers. But our nuclear deterrent is declared to NATO. It is a common asset of the alliance of which we are a leading member, except where supreme national interests are at stake. So there is a limit to the extent to which we can use those nuclear weapons, God forbid, if ever we needed to, on our own and taking our own independent political decision. So there we were, close to the United States in a lot of different ways. We had given them access to a number of our bases around the world in exchange for Lend-Lease and in exchange also for the nuclear agreement. There's a very good correspondent of the Financial Times called Philip Stevens, who I have a lot of time for, who wrote a book a year or so ago called Britain Alone. And in that, he described the special relationship from the American perspective as brutally unsentimental. And that's kind of quite harsh, but I think that there is something in that. And if you run through, which I won't bore you by doing so, the different episodes over the years of how that relationship has run, and the extent to which America has, if you like, sided with Britain or helped us out at times of difficulty, it's a little patchy. America, like every other country in the world, looks after America's own interests. So when in 1976 we had a sterling crisis, when we actually lost imperial preferences and we lost the convertibility of our own currency, America did absolutely nothing at all to help us shore up our currency, and we went cap in hand to the IMF. When in 1982, the Argentinian scrap merchants invaded South Georgia, we ended up with a war over the Falkland Islands. It was the French who had supplied a lot of the missiles to the Argentinian Navy, who helped us out more than the United States did, because this was Western Hemisphere, it was the Americas, it was a bit of colonialism, they thought. And right up until the end of my time as ambassador in Washington, which was only 7 years ago, I still could not get the American government to accept the principle of self-determination for the people who live in the Falkland Islands, even though 98% of the people who live there wish to be British and to remain British. So there are a number of issues that were important for us, where we didn't always find that the US government was helpful. Poor John Major, when he was Prime Minister, had a terrible row with Bill Clinton in the 1990s when we were busy trying to bring the troubles in Northern Ireland to an end, when so many thousands of people had lost their lives, and the White House, without consulting the British government at all, in I think 1994, gave visas to Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness to go to America to make their case for what we all regarded in Britain as a terrorist organization, and to shake the tin and do fundraising for the IRA. And for 5 days, the British Prime Minister refused to take the phone call from the President of the United States, which does not very often happen. So I tell the story just as another example of how things were not always as easy and as friendly and as we might have wished. I think the other thing I would mention in that catalogue, if you like, is that the defense relationship is both fantastically close, where the Americans kindly lend us F-35 aircraft to go on our new aircraft carriers and second members of their armed forces to our armed forces and vice versa. And they sell us a lot of the military equipment that our armed forces want, because on the whole, the Ministry of Defense buys American because they speak the same language. I simplify, but that is pretty much the instinct. But they don't buy any of our stuff because America only buys American as well. And quite a lot of the projects that we've had, whether it was Chinook helicopters or whether it's £5.5 billion spent on an armored personnel carrier called Ajax that doesn't work at the moment, we've had some real problems. And we've had some real problems also exporting British-built military equipment that has American components in it to other countries because Congress or the US government or somebody else has decided that they don't really want us to be helpful in that area. All that said, the big ticket items, let's go forward to 9/11. Tony Blair in New York, ground zero immediately afterwards, and totally supportive of George W. Bush when, after that, having gone into Afghanistan, where the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had come from, went into Iraq in 2003, much more problematic and controversial military campaign. He was there with President Bush, come what may. I think his own political career, his own political legacy, if you like, has been damaged by the perception that he was unquestioningly supportive of a military campaign that was fundamentally unwise, or at least not thought through. But it was, in part at least, because he believed that it was in the UK interest not to leave America on its own on an issue which the President of the United States regarded as of fundamental national importance, and that it was vital to the special interest, to this special relationship, and to the interests of the United Kingdom. And I think on a lot of foreign policy questions in the years since then, that has remained the case. We had a little bit of a hiccup, which I think maybe turned out to be more than that, when at the end of August 2013, just over 10 years ago, there was a moment when President Obama had drawn a red line. I'm always very wary of red lines, because once you've drawn a red line and somebody crosses it, then you've got to do something. It's like somebody who says, never point a gun at somebody unless you're prepared to pull the trigger, otherwise your bluff gets called. The Syrians, Bashar al-Assad had used chemical weapons on an industrial scale against people in Syria. And the American government has said, up with that, we will not put. And so the moment came, the American policy machinery decided it wanted to launch military attacks against the air base where the chemical weapons were flown from. And he calls up David Cameron, who is surfing at Polzeth Beach in Cornwall, because, as one does in August, and it was not an easy time for him to take a snap decision. And he said, I can't give you an answer. I'm going to have to go to Parliament, because we had already had some controversy in Parliament about whether or not the British should have joined the French and the Americans in attacking Libya to get rid of Colonel Gaddafi in 2011, and we had to go to Parliament. Went to Parliament, took a few days, thought he had a deal with the Labour Party, deal didn't hang together, and so the British Parliament voted, no, we are not supporting America in going to launch a military assault against an airbase in Syria. Now, in the end, Obama didn't go without us. He went back to his own parliament, to Congress, and asked them, or at least the leadership, what they thought, and they weren't keen either, and we ended up with a diplomatic solution, which Secretary John Kerry and I had privately discussed a few days earlier. And in the end, those chemical weapons were removed from air bases in Syria with Russian support and understanding, and it may have been the most effective way of ensuring that they didn't continue, at least in the short term, to use them. But it was a bit of a turning point, because it was a moment when the Brits could no longer immediately say, yes, we're with you, when America asked for military support in a good cause, dealing with a very bad person doing horrible things. And I think that has been something of a turning point. It doesn't mean to say we're an unreliable ally, but it means that Parliament will wish to be consulted, not only in Britain, but also in America and a number of other countries, before we leap into action militarily in the way in which traditionally Britain and America often has in the past. I think I should just say a word about Afghanistan, where we were there right at the beginning after 9/11. There was actually a coalition of 35 different countries which joined America in agreeing that what Osama bin Laden and his cohorts had done in New York and in Pennsylvania on that horrible day could not go unpunished. But then the war drew on, a lot of the other members of the coalition withdrew, the Brits and the Americans remained very firmly there. It went on for almost 20 years. It was only in August of 2021 that finally the military withdrawal of the members of that coalition was completed. You'll all remember just what a chaotic shambles it was, I'm sorry to say, for a lot of different reasons, and I can answer questions if anybody wants to. It was a very unpleasant, because a lot of very brave people who'd risked their lives defending British and American interests, and human rights lawyers and innocent girls trying to go to school, a lot of those people were left behind in the rush to leave. And I think that politically here, it was one of those episodes when British government ministers and generals publicly criticized America, which did not go down tremendously well in Washington, because they had at least consulted us about what they were doing. And it was a pretty shameful way, I'm afraid, for an exercise to end, which had begun almost 20 years ago with the best possible intentions. It ended badly, partly because Donald Trump had taken decisions while he was still president about withdrawing on a certain date. And it would have been quite hard to undo that policy completely without the war between the American soldiers who were still in Afghanistan and the Taliban resuming, because there was essentially a ceasefire up until that point. So that was, I think, an unfortunate time. Then a word a little bit about where we got to after President Obama, and then we ended up with President Trump coming in and taking office. I recall I left Washington in January of 2016, the end of my diplomatic career, and Trump was elected in November of that year. And I had one of my last political breakfasts with pundits and journalists, sort of people who I enjoyed shooting the breeze with, came and sat around a circular table, 9 or 10 of us, in January of that year. And I did something I never normally did, and I asked them all to express an opinion, which was, first of all, who will the Republican candidate in the presidential election in 10 months' time be? And secondly, who will be the next president of the United States after Obama has gone, because he had done his 2 terms. And 9 out of 10 people thought that the Republican candidate would be Ted Cruz. One of us thought it was going to be Donald Trump. And everybody thought the next president was going to be Hillary Clinton. So that was, some of the great political experts of Washington just 9 or 10 months before completely the opposite happened, which just shows how much the arrival of Donald Trump upset, if you like, traditional calculations and made life more difficult. I would say it made life more difficult for the special relationship as well, because although when Donald Trump was elected in late 2016, he trumpeted, sorry, bad pun, that he was Brexit president and he was Brexit Trump. And it was because the Brits had voted for Brexit in June of 2016 that this showed that the downtrodden, ignored, underprivileged people who had been taken for a ride by the elite could rise up and do what they wanted to do and change the political scenery. And the same thing had happened in America, where the same people had supported him and got rid of the traditional political elite and chosen a man of the people, Donald Trump, as he liked to project himself. So he was very keen on that. That said, and he talked about a shiny new comprehensive free trade agreement that was going to be negotiated between Britain and America in order to compensate Britain for the loss of trade with the European Union. That was always bluster. It was never going to happen. I'm a veteran of free trade negotiations between Britain and America. We didn't need the agreement and we weren't going to get one. And if we did get one, it was going to make things worse. So it never happened, and that was all just bluster. And then he made Theresa May's life much more difficult by interfering with the very difficult negotiations that she was having in trying to make Brexit work and get the withdrawal agreement through not only the European Union, but through her own majority in the House of Commons. And 3 times, we all recall, that she tried and failed to get it through. But there was Donald Trump in the background, making life difficult and criticizing what she was trying to do. So even on the one subject where he claimed to be supportive of Britain, he was, by the way, anti-NATO, anti-European Union, anti-free trade, pro-protectionism, and all that stuff. Even on the one subject where he said he was trying to be helpful, he was actually deeply unhelpful. He left, eventually, after losing the election, as the rest of us see it, and then we have got President Biden. Now, with President Biden, we have, if you like, a return to normal special relationship, normal behavior by American leader of the free world politicians. In other words, multilateralist, pro-NATO, supportive of the European Union, believe in the rule of law. International institutions are a good thing, not a bad thing. And generally speaking, engaging with allies and partners to try to make the world a better and a safer place. And I think that's essentially what President Biden was trying to do. What the Brits had to recall, and I got shouted at by Boris Johnson once or twice for telling him this, because I don't think he really wanted to hear it, was that President Biden, for all his other many warm and attractive characteristics, was still something of the sort of grumpy Irish-American grandpa who did not take kindly to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 being messed about with by Brexit, and was generally speaking, so according to the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and so on, much more of an Irish-American than he was of an English-American. He and I used to have a bit of banter about that. And oddly enough, when he was in Ireland about 6 months ago, I was in Turkey at the time, my phone rings and President Biden comes on the phone to talk to me about whether he was Irish or whether he was American and the jokes that we had exchanged beforehand. And I had once given him a book, which I'd had printed specially, written by his great-great-grandpa, who was an English sea captain working for the East India Company in the middle of the 19th century. And it was all about discipline on board ship. Not exactly a page-turner, but it was at least written by his antecedent, called Biden, and I had it printed and gave it to him as a gift, if only just to remind him that he wasn't entirely Irish-American, he was a bit British as well. Anyway, he rang me up to tell me the story, and he relayed this in a couple of speeches in Ireland, but the real reason he rang up was because he'd lost the book. Not, I hasten to add, because poor Joe Biden is 80 years old, but because poor man gets 10,000 books given to him every 5 minutes, and when you move from being vice president to president, and then you're and out of office, when Trump comes in, then you go back into the Oval Office, who knows where your personal possessions ended up? The Secret Service and the removals people have put it, who knows where. So could I find him another copy of the book written by his great-great-grandfather about the East India Company and discipline on board ship? So, of course, I was delighted to do so, and rather touched that he remembered that we'd done this and we'd had this conversation all those years earlier. So, a president very attached to relations with Ireland, his roots in Ireland, but also to Britain, a true multilateralist, like almost every foreign president I've ever dealt with, loves being in the presence of the royal family, adored the Queen. When I went to say goodbye to President Obama when I was leaving my office there, he said, well, why haven't you got the Queen to come back here for the state visit in return for the wonderful visit that my family and I had to London? And I said, well, Mr. President, I've been trying to do that for the last 2 or 3 years, but I couldn't get an answer from you. And now it's too late because the Queen is not traveling anymore. She's a bit past that. Well, he said, in that case, I'll just have to go to London and say goodbye to her myself before I leave office, which he did. At which point I'd said, well, it's been my great honor and privilege to serve my country and to be engaging with your administration. Mr. President, thank you for everything. And he kind of looked at me and he said, well, Mr. Ambassador, we'll miss your wife. So, put me in my box. She was actually an American, and is an American subject, who is a member of the Democratic Party, but even so, I thought that was a little unkind. So, here we are, or joke, I should say. Here we are at a rather important time for America, for our relationship, for, dare I say it, the security of freedom-loving countries and indeed the big strategic alliances across the world. We've got the rise of China, a huge subject on its own, which we can talk about at great length. We've got a malevolent and almost psychopathic president in Russia, illegally invading his next-door neighbor, lying about it, lied about it beforehand, lied about it afterwards, and with a culture in the Russian military which is almost encouraging people to rape, torture, murder, behave badly. I mean, it's almost as if that's how the Russian army works. And the evidence that's coming through from Ukraine is truly horrific. And the rest of us, I think, have to stand up against that. But the reason I mention it now, apart from the fact that it is one of the big international issues that we are all trying to address, is that we do need to keep in mind that if in November 2024, 13 months away, Donald Trump is once again elected President of the United States, which I do not think is impossible, that the idea of a very strong Western response and continued Western US-led support for Ukraine as it defends itself and its people against the invading Kremlin forces, all that is very much up in the air. Trump has boasted he would do a deal on Ukraine in 24 hours. We know what sort of deal that would be, and we know what he thinks of his friend Vladimir Putin. We also know that forgetting Donald Trump for the time being, just look at what's been happening in American politics in the last 2 or 3 days. The first time ever they've thrown out, the largest party in the House of Representatives has thrown out the Speaker because he fell out with a very small, rather hardline member group of his own party. And one of the casualties of that is that in the spending bill that has been authorized to keep the government open and avoid a shutdown, there is no money for continuing support to Ukraine as it fights back against Russia. Now, what's going to happen to that? If Trump is back in the White House, we're pretty sure what will happen to it. But even in the much shorter term, there is a real problem if American appropriations, money for weapons and economic support to Ukraine, is suddenly going to dry up. As it happens, the latest proposals in the European Union to support Ukraine, which are for something like 46 billion euros, which is bigger than Europe's ever done before, is commensurate with what America has been doing until now. So Europe is, fortunately, stepping up to the plate, and that's going to make a difference. But what happens in America is going to affect what happens in Ukraine. What happens in America is going to affect also the future viability of the international organizations of which we are all members, and which help keep the world safe and secure, and which, if they're working properly, keep trade flowing, a degree of prosperity, can help us address the challenges of climate change, and can try and help keep malevolent players in order, even if there are some very big countries around the world which don't think that they should apply the international rules-based order that the rest of us put together after the Second World War. They don't think that should apply to them because they were put together by Western colonialists who were busy trying to suppress Mother Russia or the Chinese Empire or whatever it happens to be. We are going to have to work together. And if we don't hang together, we probably will hang separately. So I think the current situation, our relationship with America is sound, it is healthy. We get criticized a bit for our declining military capabilities, but we are on the same page. We have very close military cooperation, as I was saying just now. We have extraordinarily close cultural links. We are the biggest foreign investor in America and vice versa. We have this special, if somewhat complex, nuclear defense arrangement, which is unique in the world, which I mentioned just now. And we do an awful lot of things very closely together. I think it's extremely important that we continue to do that. I worry that some of those things might not remain as they are now if things go wrong in the elections in America in November 24. But in the meantime, I think the rest of us have to get our own act together. We've got to ensure that not only we do the right thing in Ukraine, which is one area of foreign policy where I think the United Kingdom has done a very good job in the last few years, although we were largely distracted by Brexit from playing a global role or any sort of international role for the best part of 6 years. But I think on Ukraine, we and the Americans have shown a real leadership, and that's very important, and we can keep that going. But I don't think we can afford to sit back quietly. We have got to make a success while we wait for November 24, not just of relations with America, but I would argue that we in the United Kingdom have got to make our relationship with other friends and allies, including in Europe, much more functional. When we did Brexit, we turned down the opportunity of structured foreign and security policy cooperation with the European Union. We do have some bilateral arrangements with the French, which we can beef up and we can do more of. But there's a great deal more that we can do to make, if you like, the European countries, not just the EU, but all of us in the European country, more effective together in standing up to the threats which we all have to see off and we all have to confront, whether or not we're in the European Union. I'm glad that we've moved on from the phase that we had until a year ago of, if you like, name-calling and insulting our nearest neighbours. I think that was not in the British national interest, and I understand the domestic politics didn't go down very well in other countries, and it means that some of them are still not all that keen to devote energy to fixing the relationship with Britain. I'm not talking at all about returning to the EU membership or the single market or the customs union. I think that is not even something worth thinking about for the time being. But there's a lot to be done to make the relationships work better. And people like President Macron and the Chancellor of Germany and a number of the other European heads of government are keen to help us do that. And my last little comment before I stop, which is only tangentially relevant to special relationship, is to say that given the turmoil that we've lived through in our world of foreign policy and international relations in recent years, I personally think it's really helpful and encouraging and exciting even to see our king, who is engaging in a very personal way with other heads of government around the world, in a more sort of direct, touchy-feely way than the Queen used to, who I sometimes felt was a bit behind a great glass shield in order to ensure that not too much ordinary life intrudes upon the mystery of monarchy. She did it brilliantly, but her son is doing it differently. And what is interesting, and I've seen this in France, I've seen it in Germany in recent weeks, is how well that is going down with friends and partners abroad who value the political relationship with British governments, British businesses, British tourists and so on, but also at the highest level really appreciate having a relationship with our own royal family. And that, to me, is the epitome of what we used to call in the jargon soft power. And I think it's something that we should be very pleased about and proud of. And I think the transition that's gone from the time when we had the Queen to what we now have is something which is something we should all welcome and take great pride in. So that's my little closing thought. As I say, only marginally relevant to the special relationship between Britain and America. But I've cantered through all that and tried to give you a sketch of a history, the bumps in the road, the problems of more recent years, but also, I hope, tried to say to you that it really is important that we keep it going, and it is very important that we watch also what's happening in political spheres in America, of course, but also in other countries where there are risks of the sort of populist Trumpian version of politics coming to the fore and taking over democratic institutions in other countries which are now grappling with how on earth are we going to deal with social media and artificial intelligence and disinformation campaigns and bots being sent round to try to influence the democratic process in our free countries, run by countries which do not enjoy those freedoms but think they can exploit ours to their own benefit. That is going to be one of the really big challenges for us all as we look ahead. Bill, thank you very much.